The Dakota wind carried death that morning, whistling through the tall grass like the breath of restless spirits. Tokala pressed his palm against the earth, feeling the vibrations of approaching horses long before their dust cloud appeared on the horizon. 4 riders, white men. Their horses moved with the urgent rhythm of bad news. He rose from his crouch beside Shyla's grave, the fresh mound of stones still sharp against the endless prairie. 3 days had passed since they'd buried his younger brother, and already the grief felt like winter settling deep into his bones, promising to stay. Thokahea, he whispered to the wind, using Shyla's boyhood name. First son. The irony tasted bitter now. At 28, Shyla should have lived to see his children grow tall as summer corn. Should have taught them to read the wind and stars. Should have been more than bones beneath Dakota stone. The riders crested the hill, and Tokala's jaw tightened. Sheriff Thorn led them, his gray mustache bristled with what passed for authority in these parts. Behind him rode 3 townsmen Tokala recognized, but had never trusted merchants who smiled too wide when they wanted something, frowned too deep when they didn't get it. Tokala! Thorn's voice carried across the morning air as he reined his bay gelding to a stop. Sorry for your loss. The Lakota warrior studied the sheriff's weathered face, reading the tension around his pale eyes. 20 years of living between 2 worlds had taught Tokala to recognize when white men came bearing trouble disguised as sympathy. You did not ride 2 hours to speak of sorrow. Tokala said his English precise, despite the accent that marked him as other. What brings the law to Lakota ground? Thorn shifted in his saddle leather, creaking like old bones. There's been talk about Shyla's death. Men talk, wind blows, neither changes what is. This talk has teeth, son. The sheriff's tone grew sharper. Conrad Hale's got people convinced your brother was mixed up in something dark. Claims he has proof Shyla was stealing from his warehouses, selling information to hostiles planning attacks on the railroad. Tokala's hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt, then stopped. Violence would only prove their suspicions. Shyla worked for the railroad, built track, honest work. I know that, Thorn said quietly. But Hale's got influence, money, political connections that reach all the way to Washington. He's painting a picture of savage betrayal, and too many folks are ready to believe it. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the prairie. Tokala felt the weight of his ancestors' presence in this place, their voices carried on the wind that had blown across these plains for generations beyond counting. They whispered of other times when lies had been used as weapons against the people. What does this Hale want? Tokala asked. Justice, he calls it. But I think he wants a scapegoat. Thorn's mustache twitched. There's pressure coming down from territorial authorities. They want someone to blame for the recent troubles, the missing supply wagons, the attacks on surveying crews. Shyla makes a convenient target. One of the townsmen, a thin man with nervous eyes, spoke up. Sheriff, we ought to be getting back. Folks are expecting answers. Thorn raised a hand for silence, his gaze never leaving Tokala's face. There's something else. Hale's pushing for an investigation into all Lakota working for the railroad. Claims they can't be trusted. If this gets traction, it won't just be about Shyla. It'll affect every one of your people trying to make an honest living in the territory. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Tokala closed his eyes briefly, hearing his father's voice from childhood. A warrior protects not just his own honor, but the honor of his people. What would you have me do? Tokala asked. Come to town, face the accusations, show them you're not afraid of their questions. And if their questions come with rope? Thorn's expression darkened. Not while I wear this badge. The promise hung between them like morning mist, substantial enough to see, fragile enough to dissolve at the first strong wind. Tokala had learned not to put too much faith in white men's promises, but something in the sheriff's weathered face suggested this one might hold. There is more, Tokala said. It wasn't a question. The sheriff glanced at his companions, then back. "Hale's got a proposition. Says if you marry one of the white women under his protection, it would show good faith. Prove the Lakota want peace and integration. Protection." The word tasted sour in Tokala's mouth. What white woman needs protection from Conrad Hale? That's complicated. Thorne's voice dropped lower. "There's a woman named Nora. Been staying at Hale's house since her husband died. Young widow, no family, nowhere else to go. Hale's been looking after her interests." Tokala heard the careful way the sheriff chose his words, the spaces between them filled with implications. In his experience, when powerful white men looked after vulnerable women, protection was rarely the primary concern. "And if I refuse this marriage, then Hale gets to tell everyone that the Lakota can't be trusted, that they reject the hand of friendship when it's offered. It gives him justification for whatever comes next." The morning breeze picked up, rattling the prayer ties Tokala had left on Shyla's grave. 4 colors dancing in the wind, red for the sunset direction, yellow for the sunrise, white for the north wind, black for the storms that came from the south. His brother's spirit would travel the good red road now, but the living still had to walk the difficult path of this world. "I would need to see this woman," Tokala said finally. "Speak with her. If she is to be my wife, she should choose freely." Thorne nodded slowly. "That's more consideration than most in her position could expect. I'll arrange a meeting. And Hale, let me handle Hale. For now." The sheriff turned his horse toward town, then paused. "Tokala, there are forces at work here bigger than just accusations about your brother. Be careful who you trust." As the riders disappeared over the hill, Tokala knelt again beside Shyla's grave. The stones were still cold beneath his palm, but the sun was warming the earth between them. Life and death, light and shadow, truth and lies, all part of the same endless dance. "Mishung," he whispered to his brother's spirit. "My younger brother. Your death has opened a door I must walk through. Guide my steps." The wind offered no immediate answers, but it carried the scent of distant places, of choices not yet made, of a future unwritten as the endless sky. The Hale mansion squatted on the hillside, like a great wounded beast, its Victorian gingerbread trim painted white as sun-bleached bones. Nora McKenna stood at the second-floor window, watching the Dakota wind bend the prairie grass in waves that reminded her of the ocean she'd left behind in Boston. 3 months in this territorial purgatory, and she still felt like a sparrow trapped in a gilded cage. "Mrs. McKenna." The voice behind her was soft, careful. Marie, the young Lakota woman who helped with the household work, stood in the doorway, holding fresh linens. "Mr. Hale wishes to speak with you in his study." Nora's reflection in the window glass showed a woman trying too hard to look composed. 26 years old, auburn hair pulled back in a style that suggested respectability, green eyes that revealed too much when she wasn't careful. The black mourning dress she wore had been bought in Boston for a different life, before influenza took James and left her with debts that swallowed their small estate like prairie fire. "Thank you, Marie." Nora turned from the window, noting how the girl kept her eyes downcast. In 3 months, she'd barely heard Marie speak above a whisper. "How long have you worked for Mr. Hale?" 2 years, ma'am." Marie's English carried the careful precision of someone who'd learned it as a tool for survival rather than expression. "Since my family..." The sentence died unfinished, and Nora felt the familiar ache of recognition. They were both women who'd lost everything, clinging to whatever shelter they could find in a world that offered few choices to those without money or men to protect them. The study door was mahogany and brass, heavy enough to muffle sounds, but not intentions. Nora knocked once and waited for Hale's gravelly enter before stepping inside. Conrad Hale sat behind a desk large enough to butcher a steer, his bulk filling a leather chair that creaked when he shifted. 58 years old and soft around the middle. But his pale eyes held the cold calculation of a man who'd built his fortune by recognizing other people's weaknesses. Maps covered one wall. Territorial surveys, railroad routes, mining claims. The tools of an empire builder. "Nora, my dear, please sit." He gestured to a smaller chair positioned precisely where afternoon light from the window would fall across her face while leaving his in shadow. Every conversation in this room was a negotiation, and he'd arranged the geography to his advantage. She settled into the chair, keeping her spine straight and her hands folded. 3 months of living under Hale's roof had taught her the importance of presenting the right image, grateful, but not desperate, refined, but not proud, available, but not eager. "I trust you're comfortable here," Hale said, though they both knew comfort wasn't the point. "The territorial life agrees with you. You've been very generous, Mr. Hale. I'm grateful for your kindness during my difficult circumstances." He smiled, showing teeth stained yellow by tobacco and time. "Kindness has its limits, my dear. Even Christian charity must be practical in its application." The words hung between them like smoke from his cigars, acrid and impossible to ignore. Nora had been expecting this conversation for weeks, dreading it, while knowing it was inevitable. Debts had to be paid, and she'd run out of currency except for what desperate women had always used as legal tender. "I've been thinking about your future." Hale continued, leaning back in his chair. "A woman of your breeding deserves better than serving as a companion to an old bachelor. You need a husband, protection, a place in society. I appreciate your concern, but I'm hardly ready to consider remarriage. James has been gone only 4 months. Hale's interruption was gentle but firm. "Grief is a luxury, Nora. Out here, survival requires adaptation." He opened a drawer and withdrew a folder thick with papers. "I've reviewed your late husband's debts. The situation is challenging. The Boston creditors are being patient, but patience has its price. Interest compounds daily." Nora felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the suffocating weight of numbers that grew larger no matter how small she tried to make herself. James had been a dreamer, investing in ventures that promised quick returns and delivered only elegant disasters. Love hadn't been enough to pay the bills. However, Hale continued, "I have a proposal that could resolve your difficulties entirely." "What sort of proposal?" "Marriage. To a local man of means. Someone who could assume responsibility for your debts in exchange for companionship." The afternoon light streaming through the window felt suddenly harsh against Nora's face. She'd known this moment would come, but the reality still hit like a physical blow. "Who?" "A Lakota named Tokala. He's unusual for his kind. Educated, speaks English, well, owns property. He's recently lost a brother and finds himself in need of a wife to demonstrate his commitment to peaceful relations with the territorial government." "A Lakota?" Nora's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I know it's not ideal, but consider the alternatives." Hale's tone remained conversational, as if discussing weather or crop prices. "Return to Boston and face debtor's prison. Or..." He let the implication hang unspoken. Nora had seen the other women who'd come through Hale's house, young, desperate, grateful for any shelter, until they weren't young anymore. She'd heard the late-night footsteps in the halls, the muffled sounds of transactions that had nothing to do with business ledgers. "What would be expected of me?" she asked. "Marriage in name, primarily. A demonstration of cooperation between the races. Tokala understands the arrangement's practical nature. He needs respectability. You need security. It's a business transaction that serves everyone's interests." Through the window, Nora could see Marie hanging laundry in the side yard, her movements quick and efficient. A young woman making the best of limited choices just as Nora was being asked to do. And if I refuse, Hale's smile didn't waver. I'm sure we could work out other arrangements. I'm not an unreasonable man, but his eyes said otherwise. They held the cold certainty of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted one way or another. Nora had seen that look before in Boston parlors, where desperate widows learned exactly how much their desperation was worth. I would need to meet him, she said finally. This Tokala? Of course. I'll arrange a meeting for tomorrow. He's agreed to come to town. And after the marriage, you would live on his property, maintain his household, present a united front to the community. In exchange, your debts would be resolved and you'd have the protection of marriage. Hale leaned forward slightly. It's more than most women in your position could hope for. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower, and shadows crept across the study floor like dark water. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, each note hanging in the air before fading into silence. I need time to consider, Nora said. Of course, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this have a way of disappearing. As Nora rose to leave, Hale added quietly, one more thing. Tokala doesn't know the full extent of your circumstances. It would be best if certain details remained between us. Men can be funny about such things. She paused at the door. What details? How you came to be here. The nature of our arrangement. Some truths serve no useful purpose. Walking back up the stairs to her room, Nora felt the weight of those unspoken truths pressing down like storm clouds. At her window, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast and empty as the future she was being asked to accept. Below in the yard, Marie had finished hanging the laundry and disappeared back into the house, leaving only white sheets flapping in the wind like surrender flags. The mercantile store smelled of leather tobacco and the desperate hope of frontier commerce. Tokala stood near the back wall, studying a display of farming tools while keeping one eye on the front door. Sheriff Thorne had arranged this meeting carefully public enough to be respectable private enough for honest conversation. The bell above the door chimed, and he turned to see a woman in black enter, followed by Marie Running Bear. The girl worked for Hale now, though Tokala remembered when she'd lived with her family near the river before the troubles began, before young Lakota women started disappearing like morning mist. Mrs. McKenna, Thorne said, rising from behind the counter where he'd been pretending to examine harness leather. Allow me to present Tokala. The woman stepped forward, and Tokala found himself studying green eyes that held wariness and intelligence in equal measure. She was smaller than he'd expected, with auburn hair pulled back severely and pale skin that suggested recent grief. Pretty, but in the fragile way of flowers trying to bloom in hard ground. Mr. Tokala. Her voice carried Boston's careful vowels. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Just Tokala, he said. Mr. is for white men who need titles to know their place. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Then please call me Nora. They stood facing each other across the narrow aisle between bolts of fabric and patent medicines, two people weighing the cost of choices they'd never wanted to make. Behind them, Thorne busied himself with examining goods that suddenly required his complete attention. Sheriff Thorne explained the situation. Nora said, Your brother, the accusations. I'm sorry for your loss. And I for yours, a husband, the sheriff said. Yes, James. He died of influenza last winter. The simple words carried undertones. Tokala recognized the careful way people spoke of deaths that left more questions than answers. His own experience with loss had taught him when not to press for details. Children, he asked. No. Another careful pause. Tokala nodded, understanding that some sorrows cut too deep for easy explanation. He gestured toward a pair of chairs near the window. Perhaps we should sit. Speak plainly about what this marriage would mean. They settled into the wooden chairs, angled to face each other, but not so close as to make either uncomfortable. Through the window, the main street of Deadwood showed its afternoon face, dusty, busy, full of men and women, trying to build something permanent from temporary hopes. Hale tells me this would be a practical arrangement, Nora said. Marriage for appearance, not what marriages usually involve. The sheriff suggested something similar. A way to prove the Lakota can be trusted, that we choose cooperation over conflict. Takala studied her face, noting the tension around her eyes. But I wonder what Hale gets from this arrangement. What do you mean? In my experience, Conrad Hale does nothing unless it profits him. If he's pushing this marriage, he sees benefit beyond peace between our peoples. Nora's hands twisted in her lap, working the fabric of her black dress. I'm not sure I understand. You're living in his house, under his protection, dependent on his generosity. Takala kept his voice gentle but direct. That kind of debt usually comes with expectations. Color rose in her cheeks, and she looked toward the window. Mr. Hale has been kind to me during difficult circumstances. Kindness that requires repayment. She turned back to meet his gaze, and he saw something fierce flicker behind the careful composure. I won't be anyone's whore if that's what you're asking. Not his, not yours, not any man's. The words hung between them like a blade sharp and necessary. Takala nodded slowly, respecting the steel beneath her refined exterior. Good. I have no interest in unwilling wives or purchased women. If we do this thing, it will be as equals choosing a difficult path together. Equals. Her laugh held no humor. I'm a penniless widow living on charity. You're a man with land, reputation, independence. We're hardly equals. You think land makes a man free? Takala gestured toward the window where dust devils danced in the street. Every day I wake wondering if this will be the day they decide I'm too dangerous to tolerate. When accusations become rope, when suspicion becomes bullets. My brother worked honestly for white men and died for it. What kind of freedom is that? Nora studied his face, seeing something she hadn't expected. You're afraid. I'm careful. There's a difference. But the result is the same. I need allies. Someone who can speak for me in places my voice isn't welcome. And I need... She paused, choosing words carefully. Security. Protection from men who see widows as opportunities rather than people. They sat in silence for a moment, each weighing what the other offered against what they'd be giving up. Through the window, Marie could be seen waiting near a freight wagon, her posture suggesting patience, born of having few alternatives. If we married, Nora said finally, what would you expect of me? Keep house. Prepare meals. Present the appearance of a proper frontier wife when necessary. Takala hesitated. And perhaps help me understand your people better. The way they think, what they value, how to navigate their expectations. In exchange, protection, respect, a home that's yours by right, not charity. He leaned forward slightly. And honesty. Whatever else this arrangement becomes, it will be built on truth between us. Even uncomfortable truths, especially those. Nora was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving between his face and the street beyond the window. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. There are things about my situation, about how I came to be dependent on Mr. Hale, that you might find troubling. The things that would change how I see you, they might. Takala considered this, thinking of his own secrets and the growing suspicions about his brother's death, and the dangerous questions he'd begun asking the enemies he might be making. We all carry burdens we'd rather not share. The question is whether we can carry them together. You think we could, despite everything that divides us? Race, culture. The fact that we're strangers making a bargain with our lives. He almost smiled. Those are just the obvious problems. I'm more concerned with whether you can live with a man who refuses to pretend the world is fair or safe or forgiving. And I wonder if you can live with a woman who's learned that survival sometimes requires compromise with people you'd rather fight. They looked at each other across the space between their chairs, two people who'd been shaped by loss and hardened by necessity. The afternoon light was beginning to slant lower, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle announced another day's ending. When would this marriage take place? Nora asked. Soon. Hale wants visible proof of cooperation before the territorial investigators arrive next week. And after, we go to my land. Build whatever life we can from what we're willing to give each other. Nora rose from her chair, smoothing her black dress. I need tonight to think, of course. Tokala stood as well. But know this, if you agree, I will do everything in my power to protect you. Not because you're my property, but because you'll be my partner in this difficult thing we're attempting. She studied his face one last time, looking for deception or false promises. Finding neither, she nodded once and walked toward the door where Marie waited. As they left, Tokala heard her say quietly to the Lakota girl, What do you think of him, Marie? Should I trust him? Marie's response was too soft to hear, but her nod was visible through the window as they climbed into Hale's wagon for the ride back to the mansion on the hill. The territorial courthouse was a monument to bureaucratic ambition, its brick facade rising from the prairie like a declaration that civilization had come to stay. On this gray October morning, it served as witness to a marriage that would bind two lives together in hope of keeping them both alive. Nora stood before the oak doors, her hands steady despite the storm of doubts churning in her chest. She'd traded her black mourning dress for blue calico, the finest thing she owned that wasn't a reminder of death. The change felt significant, like shedding an old skin. You sure about this, miss? Sheriff Thorne's voice carried genuine concern. He'd been pacing the courthouse steps for 10 minutes, his nervousness more obvious than hers. As sure as anyone can be when they're wagering their life on a stranger's character. Nora adjusted her shawl against the morning chill. Where is he? Coming up the street now. She turned to see Tokala approaching on foot, his black hair loose around his shoulders, wearing what looked like his finest clothes. Dark trousers, white shirt, and a vest of beaded leather that caught the weak sunlight. Behind him walked an older Lakota man, whose weathered face suggested he'd seen enough of life to judge the day's proceedings with appropriate skepticism. My uncle Joseph Crow Feather, Tokala said as they reached the courthouse steps. He insisted on witnessing what he calls my great foolishness. The older man studied Nora with eyes like winter flint. When he spoke, his English was slow but precise. You know what you do. White woman marriage to Lakota brings trouble from both sides. I've had trouble from my own side already. Nora replied. Perhaps it's time to try a different kind. Joseph's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but acknowledgement of an acceptable answer. We see how long your courage lasts when neighbors call you squaw lover, Joseph, Tokala warned. Truth should be spoken before vows, not after. The old man's gaze shifted between them. But you both have eyes open. That's something. Inside, the courthouse smelled of ink tobacco and the desperate hope of legal proceedings. Judge Harrison was a thin man with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone trying to do right in a situation where right was hard to define. He'd known this marriage was coming. Territorial business traveled fast in a small community. Are we ready to proceed? Judge Harrison asked, settling behind his bench. Conrad Hale entered through the rear door, his bulk filling the doorway, as he surveyed the small gathering. Just wanted to witness this historic moment. First marriage between a Lakota and a white woman in the territory, I believe. Tokala's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Nora felt the older man's presence like a cold wind, carrying implications that made her skin crawl. Whatever game Hale was playing this ceremony was just one move on a larger board. Very well, Judge Harrison said. Mr. Tokala, Mrs. McKenna, please step forward. They stood before the bench close enough that Nora could smell sage smoke in Tokala's hair and see the tension in his shoulders. This was as strange for him as it was for her, two people from different worlds trying to build a bridge with their lives. Marriage is a serious undertaking. Judge Harrison began, made more serious by the circumstances that bring you here. In the eyes of the law, you will be husband and wife, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Behind them, Hale shifted in his seat, the sound loud in the quiet courtroom. Nora wondered what he was thinking, what he saw when he looked at this ceremony. Victory, the completion of some larger plan. She forced herself not to turn around. Do you, Tokala, take this woman as your lawful wife to protect and provide for her according to the customs of civilized marriage? I do. His voice was steady, carrying no hesitation. Do you, Eleanor McKenna, take this man as your lawful husband to honor and support him as a faithful wife should? The moment stretched like a held breath. Nora felt the weight of everyone's attention, the significance of words that would reshape her life completely. In Boston, she'd been a merchant's wife with calling cards and tea parties. Here she was about to become something the polite world would struggle to name. I do. Then by the authority vested in me by the territorial government, I pronounce you husband and wife. Judge Harrison smiled. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Tokala. Tokala turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers for permission. Nora nodded slightly, and he leaned down to brush his lips against hers, the briefest possible contact, gentle and respectful. It was her first kiss from any man, except James, and it tasted of beginnings rather than endings. No congratulations, Judge Harrison said. May your union bring peace between your peoples and happiness to your household. As they signed the marriage certificate, Nora caught sight of Marie standing near the back of the courtroom. The young woman had been watching the ceremony with an expression of careful neutrality, but when their eyes met, she offered the smallest nod of what might have been approval. Outside the courthouse, autumn wind scattered leaves across the dusty street. Nora found herself standing next to a man who was now legally her husband, surrounded by people whose motives she only half understood. Well, Hale said, approaching with his politician's smile. History has been made today. I trust this arrangement will prove beneficial to everyone involved. Time will tell. Tokala replied, his tone carefully neutral. Indeed it will. Hale's gaze moved to Nora. Mrs. Tokala now, I suppose. Your belongings have been packed and loaded into the wagon. I thought you'd want to begin your new life without delay. The speed of it caught her off guard. Marriage relocation, the severing of her last connections to the life she'd known, so compressed into a single morning. But that was probably intentional. Hale wasn't a man who allowed time for second thoughts. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Hale, she said. Think nothing of it. His smile showed too many teeth. I'm sure we'll see each other again soon. Business has a way of bringing people together. As Hale's carriage disappeared down the street, Joseph Crowfeather approached them. Now comes the hard part, he said to Tokala in Lakota, then switched to English for Nora's benefit. Making marriage work when it begins with necessity instead of love. Love is for young people with time to waste, Nora said. We're neither. Joseph's weathered face creased in what might have been approval. You have sharp tongue. Good. My nephew needs woman who fights back. Joseph, Tokala said again, but his uncle waved him off. Truth, boy. You married warrior woman, not China doll. Better she knows what you expect. The wagon that would carry them to Tokala's land waited at the hitching post, loaded with Nora's few possessions and supplies for their new household. It wasn't much to show for 26 years of life, but it was honest cargo, no debts hidden in the corners, no obligations that would follow them home. Ready, Tokala asked. Nora looked back at the courthouse, at the town that had witnessed her transformation from desperate widow to frontier wife. Whatever came next, there would be no returning to what she'd been before. "Ready," she said, and climbed into the wagon beside the man who was now her husband. As they drove out of town, the Dakota wind carried the scent of distant places and possibilities not yet imagined. Behind them, the courthouse grew smaller until it disappeared entirely, leaving only the vast sky and the promise of a new beginning, built on honest ground. Tokala's homestead rose from the prairie like a promise kept against impossible odds. The house was larger than Nora had expected, 2 stories of solid timber with a wraparound porch that caught both morning sun and evening breezes. Outbuildings dotted the property: barn, smokehouse, root cellar, all built with the patient craftsmanship of a man who expected to stay. "It's beautiful," Nora said as their wagon crested the final hill. She'd been quiet for most of the 2-hour journey, processing the enormity of what she'd done, but the sight of the homestead stirred something hopeful in her chest. "My father and I built the main house 5 years ago," Tokala said, guiding the horses down toward the barn. "He wanted something that would last, that would show the white officials we understood their ways." "Where is he now?" "Winter camp with the rest of our band. They follow the old patterns: summer in the hills, winter in the river bottoms, where there's shelter and game." His voice carried complicated emotions. "I chose to stay to prove a Lakota could live like a white man, if that's what it took to keep the peace." The wagon rolled to a stop near the front porch, and Nora found herself looking at what would be her home. Not a temporary shelter while she figured out her next move, not charity that came with unspoken expectations, but home. The word felt strange after months of uncertainty. "Second thoughts?" Tokala asked, noting her hesitation. "Third and fourth thoughts," she admitted, "but no different conclusions." He climbed down and offered his hand to help her from the wagon. His palm was calloused from work, steady and warm despite the autumn chill. "Come, let me show you what we're working with." The front door opened onto a main room that managed to be both spacious and welcoming. Furniture built from local timber rugs, woven in patterns that mixed Lakota tradition with frontier practicality walls. Lined with books that suggested long winter evenings spent reading. It was a home built by someone who thought carefully about comfort. "The kitchen is through here," Tokala said, leading her toward the back of the house. "Root cellar keeps things cool year-round. Pump brings well water right to the sink, no carrying buckets from outside." Nora ran her hand along the smooth wooden counter, noting the careful craftsmanship. "You built all this yourself?" "Most of it. Had help with the heavy timber work." He paused. "Shyla did the detail carving on the cabinets. He had good hands for that kind of work." The mention of his dead brother brought gravity back to the afternoon. Nora studied the intricate patterns carved into the cabinet doors, traditional Lakota designs flowing into frontier functionality. A bridge between worlds built in wood and careful attention. "He was an artist," she said. "He was many things. Artist, dreamer, bridge builder like me." Tokala's voice grew quiet. "He believed we could find a way to live between the old life and the new one. Maybe he was right. Maybe he just ran out of time to prove it." They moved through the rest of the house, a small study lined with legal documents and territorial maps, a bedroom that would be hers. "I'll sleep in the loft until we decide otherwise." And a second bedroom that had clearly been Shyla's. The bed was still made clothes, still hanging on pegs, as if he might return at any moment. "I haven't been able to," Tokala began, then stopped. "I understand. After James died, I kept his coffee cup on the kitchen table for 2 months. Grief needs its own time." They climbed narrow stairs to the loft that would serve as Tokala's bedroom, a space under the eaves with windows facing east and west. From here, the view stretched endlessly, rolling prairie grass, distant hills, sky that seemed to go on forever. "It's so quiet," Nora said, stepping to the western window. "Too quiet for some people." The nearest neighbor is 5 miles north town, is 12 miles south. Winter months, you might not see another soul for days at a time. That sounds wonderful. Takala looked surprised. Most white women find the isolation difficult. Most white women haven't lived in Conrad Hale's house wondering when kindness might require repayment. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying 3 months of suppressed fear and resentment. What kind of repayment? Nora moved away from the window, not ready to meet his eyes. The kind, desperate women learn to expect from powerful men who offer help with no visible strings attached. Did he? No. But not from lack of interest. She wrapped her arms around herself, remembering late-night footsteps in the hallway doors that locked from the outside conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. I was useful to him as the respectable widow proof of his Christian charity, but that usefulness was temporary. Takala was quiet for a long moment, processing this information and what it meant about the forces that had shaped their marriage. Is that why you agreed to this arrangement, to escape whatever Hale had planned? Partly. But also because she turned to face him. Because you spoke to me like I was a person making a choice, not a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be exploited. They stood in the gathering dusk, husband and wife by law, but still strangers by experience, each carrying secrets that would take time to share. Through the window, the first evening stars were appearing in the darkening sky. I should start supper, Nora said. I'll bring in your things, get the horses settled. They moved through their first evening as married people, with the careful choreography of actors learning new roles. Nora explored the kitchen, finding it well-stocked and organized. Clearly, Takala had been taking care of himself competently. She prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and preserved meat, nothing fancy but filling and warm. They ate by lamplight at a table built for 4, and the empty chairs reminders of the family gatherings that might have been. Conversation was sparse, but not uncomfortable. Small observations about the food, the weather, practical questions about household routines. Tomorrow I'll show you the property boundaries, Takala said as they finished eating. Important to know where we end and other people's claims begin. How much land? 160 acres. Good water, decent soil, enough timber for fuel and building materials. He paused. It's not wealth by white standards, but it's independence. Independence is worth more than wealth to people who've lost both. After supper, they sat on the front porch listening to the prairie wind and the distant sound of coyotes calling across the darkness. The sky was a vast dome of stars, brighter and more numerous than anything Nora had seen in Boston or even in town. Does it ever feel overwhelming? She asked. All that space, all that emptiness. Never empty. Full of life, just not the kind you're used to noticing. Takala pointed toward a grove of cottonwoods near the creek. Deer trail runs through there. Owl family nests in the big oak by the barn. Prairie dogs have a town about a 1/4 mile east. A town, underground city. Tunnels, chambers organized like any human settlement. They have sentries, leaders, social rules. Different from us, but not less complex. As they prepared for bed, moving through the rituals of toothbrushing and hair braiding with the awkwardness of people still learning each other's habits, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced in months: safety. Not the brittle security of dependence, but the deeper peace of belonging somewhere without apology. Good night, husband, she said at her bedroom door. Good night, wife, he replied from the foot of the loft stairs. The words felt strange, but not unpleasant titles they'd chosen, rather than inherited roles they could define for themselves, rather than accept from others. It was a beginning, tentative but honest, built on mutual need, but hopeful of growing into something more substantial. Outside, the wind continued its ancient conversation with the grass, and Nora fell asleep to the sound of a world larger and more patient than human schemes. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a territorial messenger, whose nervousness suggested the weight of its contents. Tokala read it twice before setting it carefully on the kitchen table where Nora was kneading bread dough, her sleeves rolled up and flour dusting her forearms. "Territorial investigators want to interview me tomorrow," he said quietly. "About Shyla's death and the allegations Hale has been spreading." Nora's hands stilled in the dough. 2 weeks of marriage had taught her to read the tension in his voice, the way he went very still when anger threatened to overwhelm practical thinking. "What kind of allegations?" "That Shyla was selling information to hostile bands, that he helped plan attacks on surveying crews and supply wagons, that his death was the result of conflict within a larger conspiracy against territorial development." "That's ridiculous. From everything you've told me, your brother was trying to build bridges, not burn them." Tokala moved to the window, looking out at the autumn morning. Frost had touched the grass during the night, turning the prairie silver in the early sunlight. Truth matters less than what people are willing to believe. And people are very willing to believe that Indians can't be trusted, even the ones trying to cooperate. The bread dough forgotten. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and joined him at the window. "What will you tell them?" "The truth. That Shyla worked, honestly lived, honestly died for reasons that had nothing to do with rebellion or conspiracy." His jaw tightened. But investigators don't ride this far from the territorial capital to confirm innocence. They come to build cases. Then we'll make sure they build the right case. The use of "we" wasn't lost on either of them. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, they'd begun thinking as partners rather than strangers bound by legal convenience. It had happened gradually in shared meals and divided chores and evening conversations on the front porch, in the small kindnesses that built trust between careful people. "There's something else," Tokala said. "The letter mentions interviewing you as well. As my wife, your testimony about my character and activities would carry weight with territorial authorities." Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with autumn weather. "What could I tell them? We've been married 2 weeks. I hardly know your character myself. You know I don't plot against survey crews from our kitchen table. You know I spend my days working the land, not meeting with hostile war parties." He turned to face her. Sometimes the absence of evidence is evidence itself. "And if they ask about our marriage, about why a Boston woman would choose to marry a Lakota man she'd just met, tell them the truth, that it was a practical arrangement that has grown into mutual respect." Tokala hesitated. "Unless you'd prefer to distance yourself from this trouble, I would understand if—" "Stop." Nora's voice was sharp enough to cut through his careful nobility. "We made an agreement. I don't abandon agreements just because they become inconvenient, even if they become dangerous, especially then." That afternoon, Sheriff Thorne rode out to warn them what to expect from the territorial investigators. He looked older than he had just 2 weeks earlier, the weight of trying to maintain peace in increasingly volatile circumstances showing in the lines around his eyes. "The lead investigator is named Morrison," Thorne said, accepting coffee at their kitchen table. "Federal appointee, no local connections or sympathies. He's got orders to determine whether there's an organized resistance movement among the reservation Indians and whether local Lakota like Tokala might be involved." "Based on what evidence?" Nora asked. "Accusations from Conrad Hale mostly, but also reports from other territorial officials about increased tensions, missing supplies attacks on railroad crews." Thorne's mustache bristled with frustration. "Morrison's got political pressure to show results. Finding a conspiracy serves that need better than finding random acts of desperation." "What about Shyla's death?" Tokala asked. "Have they investigated that?" "Officially, it was death by misadventure. Young Indian man drinking bad whiskey fell and hit his head. No crime, no conspiracy, no need for further investigation." "Except Shyla didn't drink," Tokala said quietly. "Everyone who knew him could tell you that." "I know, you know. But Morrison doesn't know, and Hale isn't eager to provide that information. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for questions that would come with the weight of federal authority behind them. Tokala gathered documents showing his legal ownership of the homestead, his business dealings with local merchants, his efforts to maintain peaceful relations with territorial officials. Nora practiced answering questions about their marriage in ways that emphasized legitimacy, while avoiding details that might complicate the narrative. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, Nora asked the question that had been troubling her all day. "Do you think Hale killed your brother?" Tokala was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of suspicions he'd been carrying alone. "I think Shyla discovered something he wasn't supposed to know. Something about Hale's business dealings, or his connections, or his plans for the territory." He paused. "And I think Hale is using these accusations against me to prevent anyone from looking too closely at what Shyla might have found." "What kind of thing? I don't know yet." But Shyla was working for the railroad, helping survey new routes, mapping resources. He was in a position to see patterns that others might miss, where the money was really flowing, who was getting rich from territorial development, what deals were being made in back rooms. A coyote called from somewhere out in the darkness, its voice rising and falling like a question posed to the night. Nora pulled her shawl closer against the chill, thinking about the tangled web of politics and greed that had somehow caught them both. "If you're right about Hale," she said, "then tomorrow's interview isn't really about clearing your name. It's about protecting his." Which means they've already decided what they want to hear. Our job is to give them just enough truth to satisfy their questions without saying anything that might point them toward inconvenient discoveries. And if we can't walk that line, Tokala's hand found hers in the darkness, calloused fingers intertwining with soft ones. Then we face whatever comes together. That's what partners do. The word hung between the partners, not just in legal marriage, but in the dangerous game they were being forced to play. 2 weeks ago, they'd been strangers making a bargain of convenience. Now they were allies, preparing to defend each other against forces that threatened to destroy everything they were trying to build. "I'm scared," Nora admitted. "Good. Fear keeps you careful, and careful is what we need to be tomorrow." As they prepared for bed, moving through their evening routine with the easy familiarity that had developed between them, Nora found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she'd been a proper Boston widow, her biggest concern whether she could afford new gloves for church. Now she was a frontier wife, preparing to lie to federal investigators to protect a husband she was only beginning to know. But as she settled into her bed and listened to Tokala moving around in the loft above, she realized something had changed in the past 2 weeks. The fear was real. But so was something else, a sense of purpose of fighting for something worth defending. For the first time since James's death, she felt like she was living her own life rather than just surviving it. Tomorrow would bring questions designed to trap them. But tonight they were safe in their home, surrounded by honest walls and the vast prairie that held secrets older than human schemes. Federal investigator Morrison had the pale, soft look of a man who'd spent his career behind desks, making decisions about frontier life from the safety of Washington offices. He sat in Sheriff Thorne's office like a judge at tribunal, flanked by 2 assistants whose notebooks were ready to record every word that might be twisted into evidence. "Mr. Tokala." Morrison began his voice, carrying the authority of federal appointment. "Thank you for coming in voluntarily. This cooperation will be noted in our report." Tokala sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, every muscle controlled. Beside him, Nora projected the calm respectability of a proper frontier wife. Her dress modest, her posture erect, her expression attentive, but not anxious. "I'm happy to help the territorial government in any way I can," Tokala said. "Excellent. Let's begin with your brother Shyla. Tell me about his work for the railroad." "Track laying mostly. sometimes surveying when they needed someone who knew the country well. He was proud of the work, saw it as building the future. Morrison's assistant scribbled notes while the investigator studied Tokala's face for signs of deception. Did he ever express concerns about the railroad's impact on Indian lands? He understood that change was coming whether we embraced it or not. He chose to be part of shaping that change rather than fighting it uselessly. Yet there have been attacks on railroad crews, supply wagons, stolen survey equipment destroyed. Someone is fighting the railroad's progress. Someone, yes, but not Shyla and not me. Morrison leaned forward slightly. Mr. Hale has provided testimony that your brother had access to sensitive information about railroad routes, supply schedules, crew assignments. Information that would be valuable to those planning attacks. My brother was a laborer, not a manager. He knew where he was supposed to work each day, nothing more. Are you certain Mr. Hale suggests that railroad supervisors became careless with sensitive information around Indian workers? That they didn't consider the possibility of divided loyalties? The phrase hung in the air, like smoke from a bad fire. Nora felt Tokala's tension increase, though his expression remained carefully neutral. My loyalty is to peace between our peoples, Tokala said, as was my brother's. Yet you live apart from the reservation, maintain traditional customs, speak your native language. Some might question the completeness of your assimilation. Morrison's tone remained conversational, but the implications were clear. In his view, any retention of Lakota identity was evidence of potential disloyalty. I am an American citizen, legally married to an American woman living on land I own through legal purchase. My assimilation is complete where it matters. Morrison's gaze shifted to Nora. Mrs. Tokala, perhaps you could help us understand your husband's character. You knew him before the marriage. We met through mutual acquaintances in town, Nora said carefully. His reputation as an honest, hard-working man was well established. Yet you'd known him only briefly before agreeing to marriage. Some might find that unusual for a woman of your background. The question carried undertones that made Nora's skin crawl. Morrison was fishing for evidence of an arrangement that went beyond simple matrimony, perhaps payment for services or coercion or some other relationship that would undermine Tokala's respectability. Frontier life requires practical decisions, Nora replied. I was a widow in need of protection and companionship. He was a bachelor in need of a wife to manage his household. Our marriage serves both needs honorably. And you've observed nothing in his behavior that would suggest involvement in activities against territorial interests. Nothing whatsoever. He works his land, maintains his property, and treats me with respect and kindness. He is in every way a model citizen. Morrison made a note, then returned his attention to Tokala. Let's discuss the night your brother died. You were among those who found his body. Sheriff Thorne asked me to help search when Shyla didn't return from town. We found him near Miller's Creek, where the path crosses the water. The official determination was accidental death, intoxication, leading to a fall. Do you accept that conclusion? The moment stretched like a held breath. Tokala could challenge the official story voice, his suspicions about murder, but doing so would raise questions about who might have wanted Shyla dead and why. Questions that led straight back to Conrad Hale. The sheriff investigated thoroughly, Tokala said finally. I trust his judgment. Yet you seemed upset by the allegations against your brother's character. Allegations of involvement with hostile elements. Any man would be upset by false accusations against a dead brother who cannot defend himself. Morrison consulted his notes. Mr. Hale reports that you've been asking questions around town about your brother's death, questioning the official conclusions, suggesting alternative explanations. That seems inconsistent with accepting the sheriff's judgment. The trap was closing, and Nora could see it in the investigator's satisfied expression. Every natural reaction to grief and suspicion was being reframed as evidence of dangerous discontent. "I wanted to understand what happened," Takala said. "That's different from rejecting official findings. Understanding or preparing to take action based on alternative theories, understanding nothing more." Morrison closed his notebook with the air of a man whose questions had been answered satisfactorily, though not necessarily truthfully. "I think that covers the primary areas of concern. However, I should mention that we've received reports of a young Indian woman who may have information relevant to recent troubles in the territory." Takala's stillness became absolute. "What woman?" "Someone who worked for Mr. Hale until recently. She's disappeared, which is unfortunate, as her testimony might have clarified several points of confusion." Nora felt ice form in her veins. Marie Running Bear, the quiet young woman who'd brought her fresh linens, who'd watched their wedding ceremony with careful eyes. Now she was missing, her disappearance framed as suspicious rather than potentially tragic. "People leave the territory all the time," Nora said. "Economic opportunities, family obligations, personal reasons." "True. But the timing is interesting. Don't you think a potential witness disappears just as federal investigators arrive to examine allegations of organized resistance?" Morrison stood his assistants, following suit. "Well, I believe we have what we need for now." After the investigators left Takala, and Nora sat in the sheriff's office while Thorne poured coffee with hands that shook slightly. "That could have gone worse," Thorne said. But his tone suggested it could have gone better too. "They're not looking for truth," Takala said. "They're building a case for predetermined conclusions." "And Marie?" Nora asked. "Do you think she really just left her?" Thorne and Takala exchanged a look that spoke of shared fears they couldn't voice in front of federal investigators. "Hard to say," Thorne replied carefully. "But women like Marie don't have many choices when powerful men decide they're inconvenient." As they drove home through the afternoon light, Nora found herself thinking about the careful dance they'd just performed, truth-shaded with omission honesty, balanced against survival, love for family, weighed against loyalty to principle. "Do you think we convinced them?" she asked. "We gave them what they came looking for, a peaceful Indian and his respectable white wife living quietly and causing no trouble." Takala's voice carried bitter satisfaction. "Whether that's enough depends on what Hale wants the final report to say." "And Marie, if she's still alive, she's running. If she's not..." He didn't finish the sentence. The homestead appeared ahead of them, solid and welcoming in the late afternoon light. But as they approached their home, both knew something had changed. They were no longer just husband and wife trying to build a life together. They were potential targets in a larger game marked for attention they neither wanted nor deserved. That evening, as they sat on their front porch listening to the prairie wind, Nora asked, "What do we do now?" "We stay careful. We watch for signs of trouble. And we hope that being model citizens is enough to keep us safe." But the doubt in his voice suggested that hope might not be sufficient for what was coming. The truth began unraveling 3 days after the federal investigators returned to the territorial capital. It started with Will Jenkins, Hale's foreman, stumbling into Sheriff Thorne's office at dawn, blood on his shirt and terror in his whiskey-reddened eyes. "They gotta tell someone." Jenkins gasped, collapsing into a chair. "Can't carry this alone no more." Thorne poured coffee with steady hands, though his mind was racing. Jenkins had worked for Hale for 5 years, supervising warehouse operations and managing the flow of goods through the territory. He wasn't the kind of man who broke easily, which made his current state all the more alarming. "Take your time, Will. Tell me what's got you spooked." "It's that Indian girl, Marie. Found her body last night dumped in a ravine about 10 miles north of town." Jenkins's hands shook as he lifted the coffee cup. "Wasn't no accident, Sheriff. Someone worked her over real thorough before they killed her." Thorne felt ice form in his stomach. "You sure it was Marie Running Bear?" Had that little beaded bracelet she always wore. And Jenkins swallowed hard. I recognized her because I'd seen her before, at places she wasn't supposed to be. What kind of places? Railroad depot warehouse. Locked rooms where Hale keeps special cargo. Jenkins looked up, his eyes hollow with guilt and fear. Sheriff, there's things happening in this territory that ain't legal. Ain't right. And that girl found out about them. The story that emerged over the next 2 hours painted a picture of corruption that reached from Conrad Hale's mansion all the way to territorial officials in the capital. The railroad wasn't just moving legitimate freight through its depot. It was serving as a pipeline for human trafficking. Moving young Native women from reservation to reservation, selling them to mining camps and frontier brothels, where their disappearances would go unnoticed. How long has this been going on? Thorne asked. 2 years, maybe more. Started small, a girl here, a girl there, all of them runaways or orphans nobody would miss. But it's gotten bigger, more organized. Jenkins wiped sweat from his forehead despite the morning chill. Hale's got connections with territorial officials, federal appointees, even some of them investigators that just left. They look the other way in exchange for generous contributions to their campaigns. And Shyla. What did he have to do with this? Boy was smart. Too smart. Started noticing patterns in the cargo manifests, asking questions about why certain freight cars stayed locked, why some shipments moved at night without proper documentation. Jenkins's voice dropped to a whisper. He figured out what was happening and threatened to expose it. So Hale had him killed. Made it look like an accident. Bad whiskey, accidental fall. Who's gonna question the death of another drunk Indian? The bitterness in Jenkins's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. But Marie, she knew different. She was there that night, saw what really happened. Thorne's mind was working fast, connecting pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across months of seemingly unrelated incidents. Why come forward now? Why risk your own neck? Because they're planning something big. Tomorrow night, there's going to be a special freight shipment through the depot. 20, maybe 30 girls, all headed for mining camps in Montana territory. Some of them ain't more than 14 years old. Jenkins' voice broke. I got a daughter that age, Sheriff. I can't be part of this no more. The weight of the revelation settled over the sheriff's office like smoke from a poisonous fire. Thorne found himself facing a conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful men in the territory, backed by federal officials who were supposed to uphold justice. Well, if you testify to this, they'll kill you. You know that, right? Maybe. But if I don't testify, how many more girls die? How many more families lose their daughters to these monsters? Jenkins stood, his decision made. I'm ready to do what's right, Sheriff. Question is, are you? By afternoon, Thorne was riding hard toward Tokala's homestead, his mind spinning with plans and contingencies. If Jenkins was telling the truth and the foreman's terror seemed genuine, then they had less than 24 hours to stop a crime that would destroy dozens of lives. He found Tokala and Nora working in their garden, harvesting the last vegetables before the hard frost came. They looked up as he approached, and the expression on his face told them immediately that something had changed. We need to talk, Thorne said, dismounting. All of us. And we need to decide how far we're willing to go to stop something terrible. Inside the house, around the kitchen table where they'd shared so many peaceful meals, Thorne laid out everything Jenkins had revealed. As he talked, Nora's face grew pale, and Tokala's expression became stone. Marie Running Bear. Nora whispered when he finished. She was trying to tell us something at the wedding. The way she looked at us like she wanted to speak but couldn't. She knew what Hale was doing, knew she was in danger, but had nowhere to run. Tokala's voice was steady, but his hands were clenched into fists. And my brother died because he threatened to expose this trafficking ring. That's what I figure. But knowing it and proving it are different things. And stopping tomorrow night's shipment. Thorn shook his head. That's going to require more than just the three of us. What about federal authorities? Surely there are honest men in the territorial government who would act on this information. Maybe. But we don't know who's corrupt and who's clean. Contact the wrong official and Hale gets warned in time to cover his tracks. Thorn's mustache bristled with frustration. Besides, those girls don't have time for proper channels and official investigations. Tokala rose from the table, pacing to the window where afternoon light slanted across the prairie. What are you proposing, Sheriff? I'm proposing we stop that shipment ourselves. Free those girls, gather evidence that even corrupt officials can't ignore, and put an end to this trafficking ring before it destroys more lives. That's vigilante justice, Nora said quietly. Sometimes vigilante justice is the only kind available. Thorn's voice carried the weight of 20 years trying to maintain law in a lawless place. But I can't ask you folks to risk your lives for this. You've got your own safety to think about. Tokala turned from the window, his decision already made. How many men can you trust? Maybe 4, including Jenkins. All of them got reasons to see Hale brought down, but they're not professional fighters. 6 men total, then. Against how many? Hale usually has 8 or 10 guards for special shipments. They'll be armed and expecting trouble from anyone trying to steal their cargo. The odds were bad, the risks enormous, the likelihood of success questionable at best. But as Nora looked at her husband's face, she saw something that had been missing since Shyla's death purpose, that went beyond survival anger, that had found a righteous target. What would you need me to do? She asked. Both men turned to stare at her. Nora, this isn't, Tokala began. This isn't what something a proper wife should concern herself with. Her voice carried steel. Those girls in that freight car are somebody's daughters, somebody's sisters. If we can save them, we have an obligation to try. It's dangerous work, Thorn warned. So is living in a territory where powerful men traffic young women and murder anyone who threatens to expose them. Nora's green eyes flashed with determination. I didn't survive Conrad Hale's house and marry a Lakota warrior just to hide when justice needed doing. Tokala studied his wife's face, seeing strength he'd suspected but never fully witnessed. What did you have in mind? Thorn spread a hand-drawn map of the railroad depot on the table. Here's what I'm thinking. As evening shadows lengthened across the prairie, 3 people who'd been thrown together by circumstance began planning to risk everything they'd built in service of something larger than their own safety. Tomorrow night would test not just their courage, but their commitment to the fragile hope that justice might still be possible in a corrupt world. Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching winter and distant storms. The railroad depot crouched in the darkness, like a slumbering beast, its bulk outlined against storm clouds that promised rain before dawn. Tokala lay flat on his belly in the tall grass, 50 yards from the loading platform, watching guards patrol between freight cars with the lazy confidence of men who expected no trouble. 8 guards, just as Jenkins had predicted. Armed with rifles and revolvers, moving in patterns that suggested military training. These weren't simple warehouse workers, they were professionals hired to protect valuable cargo. Count again, whispered Jenkins lying beside him. The foreman's face was pale with nervous sweat, but his voice remained steady. Make sure we know what we're facing. Through the darkness, Tokala could see Sheriff Thorn and his 3 deputies positioning themselves behind the water tower on the depot's north side. Nora waited with the wagon 200 yards back, hidden in a grove of cottonwoods, where she could tend to rescued victims while staying clear of gunfire. The plan was simple in concept, dangerous in execution. Create a distraction at the main warehouse while Tokala and Jenkins freed the girls from the locked freight car. Get everyone to safety before Hale's men realized what was happening. Depend on speed surprise and righteous anger to overcome superior numbers and firepower. On there, Jenkins breathed, pointing toward a freight car positioned at the far end of the loading platform. "That's the one. See how it's got extra locks on the door, and notice how the guards keep checking on it." Tokala studied the car through the darkness. Even from this distance, he could see that it was different from the others: reinforced locks, barred windows, the kind of modifications used for transporting prisoners rather than ordinary cargo. A sound drifted across the night air, faint but unmistakable. Women's voices crying softly, murmuring in languages he recognized. Lakota, Dakota, Cheyenne. Young voices speaking the words of frightened children, calling for mothers who couldn't hear them. The sound hit Tokala like a physical blow, bringing back memories of his sister lost to smallpox when she was barely 16. These could be her daughters, her granddaughters stolen from their families and sold like livestock to men who saw Native women as less than human. "How many?" he whispered. 23, according to the manifest, ages 14 to 22. Jenkins's voice cracked. "God forgive me for being part of this as long as I was." Movement near the main warehouse caught Tokala's attention. 3 guards were walking toward the building, probably for a shift change or coffee break. This was their chance, fewer men to deal with a clear path to their target. "Signal Thorn," Tokala said. Jenkins raised a small mirror, catching moonlight and flashing it twice toward the water tower. An answering flash confirmed that the sheriff had seen and understood. They waited 10 heartbeats, then 20. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called Thorn's signal that his men were in position. Time to move. Tokala rose from the grass and began working his way toward the freight car, staying low and using shadows for cover. Behind him, Jenkins followed with the nervous energy of a man who'd committed himself to a course that would either redeem him or destroy him. The first guard never saw them coming. Tokala's knife found the man's ribs with surgical precision, sliding between bones to pierce the heart. Death was instant and silent, and they dragged the body into the darkness beneath the loading platform. The second guard was turning toward them when Jenkins struck with a crowbar, the impact echoing like an axe hitting hardwood. The man dropped without a sound, unconscious, but alive. 2 down, Jenkins whispered. 6 to go. At the freight car, the sounds of captive women were clearer. Soft weeping, whispered prayers, the rustle of bodies pressed together in cramped darkness. Tokala felt rage burn in his chest like acid, but he forced himself to remain focused. Emotion was a luxury they couldn't afford until the job was done. Jenkins produced a set of keys from his belt, sorting through them by feel until he found the right one. The lock clicked open, then the second one, then the third. He grasped the door handle and looked at Tokala. "Ready? Do it." The freight car door slid open with a metallic screech that seemed to echo across the entire depot. Inside, pale faces turned toward the sudden opening, young women huddled together like frightened animals blinking in the dim light from the depot's oil lamps. "Haksila waste," Tokala said softly in Lakota. "Good girls." "Tanyan Yaun, are you well?" A girl near the front of the car, maybe 17 years old, answered in the same language. "Han Jotunhan." "Yes, barely. We're here to help," Jenkins said in English. "We're going to get you out of here." The girls stirred hope, flickering in eyes that had grown accustomed to despair. But before anyone could move, the sharp crack of rifle fire erupted from the direction of the warehouse. "Thorne started his distraction," Jenkins said. "We need to move fast." But as the first girl climbed down from the freight cars, everything went wrong. A voice called out from the darkness behind them. Well, the heroes arrived right on schedule. Tokala spun to see Greasy Pete emerging from behind another freight car, flanked by 4 guards with rifles trained on them. Pete's scarred face split in a grin that showed missing teeth. Mr. Hale figured somebody might try something noble and stupid. Pete continued. "So he had me wait here with some extra insurance." The trap was perfect. They were caught in the open, exposed on the loading platform with nowhere to run. The girls in the freight car shrank back into the shadows, sensing that rescue had just become massacre. Jenkins, Pete said conversationally, I'm disappointed in you. After all Mr. Hale's done for you, this is how you repay his generosity. Hale's generosity includes selling children to mining camps. Jenkins replied, his voice steady despite the rifles pointed at his chest. Some things are worth dying to stop. These are noble words. Let's see how noble you feel when... Pete never finished the sentence. A rifle shot cracked from the darkness, and one of his guards spun and fell. Then another shot and another, as Sheriff Thorne and his men opened fire from their positions around the depot. But the crossfire that followed was brutal and chaotic. Guards scattered for cover, muzzle flashes lit the darkness like lightning, and the air filled with the whine of bullets ricocheting off steel rails and wooden loading platforms. Tokala grabbed the nearest girl and pulled her toward the edge of the platform. Stay low. Move toward the trees. But as he turned to help another victim, his wounded leg legacy of an old cavalry bullet gave way beneath him. He stumbled, crying out as pain shot through the old injury, and the sound carried clearly across the depot. There, Pete shouted. The Indians hit, take him down. Rifle fire concentrated on their position, forcing Tokala and Jenkins to dive for cover behind freight car wheels. Above them, the rescued girls huddled in terror as bullets sang through the air around them. We need to get them out of here. Jenkins yelled over the gunfire. They can't move in this crossfire. Tokala's leg was bleeding where the old wound had reopened, but that was the least of their problems. They were pinned down, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. Then Nora appeared at the edge of the loading platform, moving with the determined stride of a woman who'd made her choice. She carried a shotgun from their wagon and wore an expression that would have stopped charging cavalry. Get those girls to the wagon, she shouted. I'll cover you. The shotgun boomed once-twice, driving Pete's men back into cover. In the temporary respite, Tokala and Jenkins helped the terrified victims down from the platform and started them running toward the cottonwood grove where safety waited. But Pete wasn't finished. As the last girl reached the edge of the platform, he appeared behind them with a revolver in his hand. Not so fast, Indian lover, he snarled at Nora. The gun swung toward her, and time seemed to slow. Tokala was too far away. Jenkins was helping a wounded girl. The sheriff's men were engaged with other guards. Then the girl who'd first spoken to Tokala, the 17-year-old who'd answered in Lakota, lunged forward with desperate courage. Her hands closed on Pete's gun arm, just as he fired, deflecting his aim enough that the bullet went wide. Pete backhanded her brutally, sending her sprawling. But the distraction was enough. Nora's shotgun thundered one final time, and Greasy Pete disappeared into the darkness beyond the loading platform. The battle was over. In the sudden silence that followed, they could hear the sound of running horses as the surviving guards fled into the night. Tomorrow, there would be explanations, to give investigations, to face consequences, to accept. But tonight, 23 young women were free, and a trafficking ring that had destroyed countless lives was finally broken. As they helped the rescued victims into the wagon for the journey to safety, Tokala found himself looking at his wife with new understanding. She had faced armed men without hesitation, risked her life for strangers, and proven herself worthy of respect that went far beyond legal marriage. Thank you, said the young woman who'd fought Pete for his gun. She spoke to both of them, but her eyes were on Nora. You saved us. We saved each other, Nora replied, helping the girl into the wagon. That's what people do when they stand together against evil. The storm that had been threatening all night finally broke as they drove away from the depot rain, washing the smoke and blood from the air. Behind them, the freight cars sat empty and silent, their cargo of human misery finally freed. But the most important victory wasn't the battle they'd won, and it was the discovery that ordinary people, when pushed far enough, could find the courage to stand against forces that seemed overwhelming. In the wagon, surrounded by young women who would live to see their families again, Tokala and Nora rode through the storm toward whatever future they would build together. 6 months later, the territorial courthouse was packed with spectators who'd come to witness the final act of a drama that had shaken the foundations of frontier society. Conrad Hale sat at the defendant's table, his bulk diminished by prison clothes and the weight of testimony that had systematically destroyed his empire of corruption. Nora watched from the gallery, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly, where new life grew. Beside her, Tokala sat with the quiet dignity of a man who'd seen justice served, though at tremendous cost. The past months had brought trials that tested everything they'd built together, but their partnership had emerged stronger for having been forged in fire. Judge Harrison raised his gavel, and the courtroom fell silent. Conrad Hale, you have been found guilty on charges of human trafficking conspiracy accessory to murder and corruption of territorial officials. Before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say? Hale rose slowly, his pale eyes scanning the packed courtroom. For a moment his gaze lingered on Tokala and Nora, and his expression held something that might have been regret. Then he straightened his shoulders and faced the judge. Your Honor, I built this territory, brought civilization to wilderness jobs, to workers, prosperity, to communities that had nothing before I arrived. His voice carried traces of the commanding presence that had once intimidated territorial officials. If I crossed legal lines in that pursuit, it was because the law moved too slowly for the needs of progress. The law you crossed involved the enslavement and murder of innocent young women. Judge Harrison replied coldly. Progress built on such foundations is not civilization, it's barbarism with better accounting. 30 years to life in territorial prison, the judge announced, with no possibility of parole. As the gavel fell, a collective sigh moved through the courtroom, not satisfaction exactly, but the release of tension that had been building for months. Justice had been served, though it couldn't restore the lives that had been lost or fully heal the wounds that had been inflicted. Outside the courthouse, Sheriff Thorne waited with news that completed the circle of accountability. Federal investigators found evidence linking Hale's operation to similar trafficking rings in 3 other territories. He told them. The whole network is being rolled up thanks to the testimony of the women you saved. And Morrison, Tokala asked, transferred to a desk job in Washington where he can't do any more damage. Thorne's mustache twitched in what might have been a smile. Turns out, federal officials don't like being embarrassed by having their corruption exposed in newspaper headlines. The past 6 months had indeed brought unwelcome attention to the territory, but not the kind Conrad Hale had intended. Instead of covering up the trafficking ring, the raid on the railroad depot had exposed it to national scrutiny. Newspaper reporters from as far away as New York had descended on the territory to cover the story of the Lakota hero and his brave wife who smashed the Dakota trafficking ring. The attention had been uncomfortable, but ultimately beneficial. With the nation's eyes on the territory, even corrupt officials had been forced to pursue justice rather than cover-ups. The evidence against Hale had been overwhelming, the testimony of rescued victims compelling, and the political pressure for convictions irresistible. But the personal cost had been significant. Death threats had forced them to relocate temporarily to Sheriff Thorne's jail for protection. Their homestead had been burned by Hale's remaining supporters, though they'd rebuilt it with help from neighbors who'd finally understood what kind of man they'd been defending. And the stress of being thrust into national prominence had tested their marriage in ways they'd never anticipated. Are you ready to go home? Tokala asked as they walked toward their wagon. More than ready, Nora replied. I'm tired of being public figures. I want to be private people again. The ride back to their rebuilt homestead took them past places that now held different meanings than they had a year ago. The railroad depot, operating under new management with strict oversight, no longer seemed like a place where nightmares were born. The road where Shyla had died had been renamed Running Bear Memorial Highway in honor of both victims of Hale's crimes. Even the hills seemed somehow lighter, as if the revelation of truth had lifted shadows that had lain across the land too long. At their property line, they paused to look at what they'd rebuilt together. The new house was larger than the old one, with a nursery for the baby who would arrive before winter. The barn was bigger too, designed to shelter the horses they were breeding for the territorial cavalry. Their small ranch was becoming prosperous in honest ways, built on trust rather than exploitation. Sometimes I can hardly believe we survived it all. Nora set her hand moving protectively to her belly. Survival was never the question, Tokala replied. The question was whether we could build something worth surviving for. As they approached the house, they saw a familiar figure sitting on the front porch, Joseph Crowfeather Tokala's uncle, whittling a piece of wood into what looked like a small horse. "Takoja," he said in Lakota, using the word for grandson-in-law. "You missed good hunting today. Deer moving south early this year." Lexi Tokala replied, using the word for uncle. "We had business in town. Legal business finally finished." Joseph's weathered hands continued shaping the wooden toy, but his eyes studied their faces. Justice served, as much as justice ever is in this world. Nora said, settling into a chair beside him. "Hale will spend the rest of his life in prison. And the girls he sold, most have returned to their families. Some are staying in town, working for people who treat them with respect. All of them are free." Joseph nodded slowly. "Good. But what about you two? All this fighting, all this attention, has it made your marriage stronger or weaker?" It was a direct question that deserved a direct answer. Tokala and Nora looked at each other, each seeing in the other's face the evidence of battles fought and won together. "Stronger," they said simultaneously, then laughed at their synchronicity. "The marriage started as a practical arrangement," Nora explained. "But it became something real when we discovered we could trust each other in crisis. Crisis reveals character." Joseph agreed. "And character determines whether marriage becomes partnership or just two people living in same house." He held up the wooden horse he'd been carving, a beautiful piece that captured the spirit of wildness being gently tamed. "For the baby. Children need toys that teach them about the world they'll inherit. What does this one teach?" Nora asked, accepting the gift that strength and gentleness can exist in the same creature. That wildness doesn't have to mean dangerous, and tame doesn't have to mean broken. Joseph's eyes moved between them. Important lessons for child who will live between two worlds. As evening settled over the prairie, they sat on the porch talking about ordinary things, weather crops, plans for expanding the ranch, names for the baby who would arrive with the spring grass. The conversation felt precious after months of testimony and legal proceedings, newspaper interviews, and political speeches. "I've been thinking," Nora said as stars began appearing in the darkening sky, "about what we want this child to know about their parents' story." "What kind of story should we tell?" Tokala asked. "The truth. That we were two people thrown together by circumstances neither of us controlled, who chose to make something good from difficult beginnings." She paused. "That love isn't always the first ingredient in marriage, but it can grow if people are willing to tend it carefully. And that justice sometimes requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things," Tokala added. "Even when it's dangerous." Joseph rose from his chair, his joints creaking with age and old injuries. "Good stories to tell. Children need to understand that heroes aren't born different, they're made by choices to stand up when standing up is hard." As his uncle disappeared into the darkness, walking back toward the winter camp, with the steady gait of a man comfortable in wild places, Tokala found himself thinking about the strange paths that had led to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a man alone, grieving a brother's death and facing accusations that threatened to destroy everything he'd built. Now he was part of something larger, a partnership that had survived tests neither of them could have imagined. "No regrets?" he asked Nora. "About marrying you, about fighting Hale, about becoming parents?" She smiled. "None whatsoever. You, only that it took a tragedy to bring us together. But I suppose that's how most good things begin in this world, with people choosing to build something beautiful from pieces of something broken. The prairie wind carried the scent of coming winter, but also the promise of spring renewal. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the darkness, their voices weaving songs of survival and adaptation of wildness, finding ways to endure in a world that seemed determined to tame everything it touched. Inside their house, lamplight glowed warm and steady, a beacon of hope on the vast Dakota Plains shelter. For a family that had been forged by adversity and tempered by love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between easy paths and right ones. But tonight, they were home, they were safe, and they were together. In a world where justice was fragile and happiness was hard-won, that was more than enough. It was everything. This story draws inspiration from the historical reality of human trafficking on the American frontier, where vulnerable populations, particularly Native American women and girls, were often exploited by those in positions of power. While the characters and specific events are fictional, they reflect documented patterns of abuse and the courage of those who risked everything to expose such crimes. The Dakota Territory during the mid-19th century was indeed a place where federal authority was weak, corruption was common, and justice often depended on the courage of ordinary people willing to stand against powerful interests. This story honors both the victims of such systems and their heroes who fought to change them.